You can.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming today. I'm delighted to see so many people show up for our panel, especially those of you who braved the traffic in Washington, D.C. this morning. All of us on this panel are members of both the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America and of Sigma. Sigma's a think tank, little bit different from your typical think tank. For one thing, we're centered online rather than in a particular place. We have members from all over the country, even the world, depending on where we are at any particular moment. Originally, Sigma was designed to be people who were both science fiction writers, writers who looked at the future, and also those with advanced degrees in science or technology or military commissions, that sort of thing. After a while, we all realized that people had a lot to contribute. You didn't have to have a doctorate in order to have something to contribute. So that's no longer a requirement, but we are still a group of scientists and writers whose specific interest is futurism, and we consult with various government agencies and industry. What I'd like to do now is have each of the members of our panel introduce themselves, if you could give a few sentences to tell you what they do. Tom, do you want to start?
My name is Tom Ligon. I've been writing science fiction since about the 80s. Happened to have a chance to work for R.W. Bissard for a few years, and that was a real treat for any science fiction author.
Jeff, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I've already been introduced, as it turned out. I'm Jeffrey Landis. In part of my life, I'm a scientist at the John Glenn Research Center and work on basically developing new technologies for spacecraft. But I've also been involved in a number of Mars missions. Mars Pathfinder, I'm still involved with the Mars Exploration Rover science team, so we drive a rover around and poke into rocks. But in my copious spare time, which is getting harder and harder to find, I write science fiction. I've written a number of stories, even that have been set on Mars. In fact, my one novel, I've only written one novel, I mostly write short stories, but this is my novel. It's actually about Mars, Mars Crossing. It did not get quite as much attention, I'm afraid, as Andrew Ware's novel, but I am confidently waiting for that call from Hollywood saying that we have a dump truck full of money and they want to know the coordinates of my house so that they can dump it on my lawn.
Okay, I'm Michael Swanwick. I've been publishing science fiction for a third of a century. I've won the Hugo Nebula World Fantasy Award, a couple of other things. And I think my major claim to being here is that when Kim Stanley Robinson finished his first Mars book, in his Rainbow Mars series, whatever that's called, he told me that he was making a treaty with me and that I was not to write about Mars, and in exchange he would give me the moon. So that's my sole claim to Mars fame.
Okay, I'm Mary Terzillo. My high school yearbook, I still have it, the quote. You know, they give you a quote always in the high school yearbook, and it's, I want to go to the moon. Well, maybe I should have said Mars, but I said the moon, and I'm stuck with that. And I don't think I'm going to get to the moon. I might get to the International Space Station. I keep hoping. I had a novelette called Mars is No Place for Children, which is about an early colonist of Mars. And I have a novel serialized in analog called An Old-Fashioned Martian Girl. And these, I am told by Pam Sargent that these are recommended reading on the International Space Station, but I haven't been there yet, so I don't know. My special interest is in Mars is biology, technology, culture, spirituality, and language as part of a holistic look at the way Mars colonization, Mars travel and colonization is going to go. I'm a founding member of the Mars Society, and I'm working on a novel called A Mars Cat and His Boy, because I think cats should be on Mars.
My name's Catherine Asaro. I'm a theoretical physicist. My doctorate was in theoretical chemical physics from the chemical physics program at Harvard. And part of what inspired me to become a scientist was all the stories I read as a kid, including Space Cat Goes to Mars. He took along his astronaut with him. But I always dreamed of going to other planets, and so it was natural to become a writer. I'm actually a full-time writer now. I have about 25 novels published, and I've won the Nebula and other awards. I also run and direct the Chesapeake Math program, where I hope to inspire young people to dream about science and math and the stars. Okay, well, I would like to, just to give you a brief summary of what we're talking about in this panel. As writers, we're in the business of selling a dream. It's true some of us are scientists and indeed are working on Mars projects, but even more so, as writers, we hope to inspire, the population, the upcoming generations of young people and the current population of adults to dream of Mars too, or to dream of other worlds like we do. And so that's really what we're going to be talking about in this panel. And also can we help sustain the political and national will, not just to talk about Mars, but to actually get there. And I think we would like to start out with a presentation by Jeff Landis about some of the work that's going on about Mars.
Well, I just wanted to summarize a little bit the fact that science fiction has been, sorry, I wanted to start here. Science fiction has been fascinated by Mars for ages, and it started way back in the previous century, in fact, in the late 1800s, when Schiaparelli and Percival Lowell looked at Mars, and they saw this. They looked at a planet, and they saw a planet crisscrossed with what Schiaparelli called canali, and Percival Lowell liked to translate as canals. And in fact, Percival Lowell wrote the book Mars as the Abode of Life, looking at the idea that there was a great globe-spanning civilization on the planet Mars that made these phenomenal engineering works. Of course, even at the time, a lot of the astronomers looked at Mars and said, well, I can't really see that. And the better our telescopes are, the harder it is to see these canals. So even by the 1950s, the astronomers were pretty dubious, but the science fiction writers loved it. The science fiction writers said, wow, another planet that has canals, it has life, and we could go there. So here, for example, is Edgar Rice Burroughs with his green four-armed Barsoomians. And here is Ray Bradbury with the idea of the ancient, ethereal, dying civilization on Mars that human beings could go to. Unfortunately, here's just some more pictures of some views of Mars. Weird fantasy with the canal Mars. And here's Analog, when it just had stopped being astounding science fiction, sending a submarine to the planet Mars. When the first spacecraft passed by Mars, there were still some people saying, yes, we think that we can see plants and life on Mars. So the first spacecraft was a little bit disappointing. The wonderful Mars of science fiction with canals, with wonderful aliens that we were ready to go to changed. And it changed from this spacecraft, Mariner 4. The first flyby, they looked at it and said, here it is, we're approaching Mars. Here's the best pictures ever of Mars. And the scientists said, where's the canals? Where's the life? Where are the Barsoomians? They got the close-up view, and they said, oh my goodness, it's a barren desert. It looks like the moon. So for a while, science fiction turned away from Mars, and they said, let's go somewhere else. But Viking gave us a different view of Mars. Mariner in '64 gave us the view of a desert like Mars, but Viking Orbiter looked at Mars in '76 and had a little bit more nuanced view. It looked down and saw, wow, actually there are channels on Mars. Interestingly, none of the channels that Schiaparelli and Percival Lowell thought they saw are these channels, but we see dry riverbeds on Mars all over the place. We see a planet that in fact is a dying planet. a planet that once had water but doesn't. We look at it and say, wow, this is the largest mountain in the solar system. This is a planet that is really interesting. Just for comparison, by the way, here's Olympus Mons compared to Mount Everest. Mount Everest is the size of some of those little foothills that you see at the edge of Olympus Mons. This is a really big crater. So Viking and the future probes gave us a view of Mars that was a bit more interesting. Mars that had some moons that were very different from Earth's moon. Here's Phobos, which you can see. I like this view because it's a color view, and you can see the fact that Phobos looks like a lump of coal. It is a very dark moon. Of course, then we've gone to Mars now with rovers. We've looked at it, and we can see in the layers and layers of rocks a long history of Mars. So Mars is not the planet of canals and Barsoomians that we thought perhaps in the early 1900s, but it's not uninteresting. So after the Viking landers, there was perhaps a lull in Mars science fiction, but then we came back. Science fiction returned to Mars and said, wow, this is an exciting planet. This is a planet that has a lot of stories that can be told. We can go to Mars. It's real. This is a place that we can go. We can set stories. We can write about Mars. And it's not just a fantasy planet where Virginia swordsmen can go and fight four-armed Barsoomian. This is a real place. We can explore it.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, I guess the first thing really I hope the panelists could address in great detail is, so how do we use our fiction to inspire people to make this dream of Mars a reality?
Do you want to pick an order, or do we go in clockwise order?
Well, let's start with an order, but I know you guys, you're all going to jump in when you want. So let's start with Mary on this.
Okay, well, I've been thinking about this, and I've been thinking, at one time, I met Robert Zubrin a long time ago, and I was talking to him about some of my ideas and about planetary protection and stuff like that, and he looked at me and said, you're a science fiction writer. It was before I'd won the Nebula, but he said, you're a science fiction writer. He says, you know, you can do things to promote this. And that's basically what I'm trying to do, but I'll tell you something. It's not just, we don't have to just get, you know, people, you know, generally, because there are people who are lined up to go on the Mars Desert Research Station. There are people who want to be astronauts. There's people that want to go to Mars. The problem is we have to convince the old fogies in Congress, and so we've got to get them to write science fiction. And my idea is what we have to read science fiction, not write. It would be nice if they write it. That would be weird. Sometimes they do write it. I don't know. But I figure we have to get them to read it, which means we have to get it to be popular. And I think Andy Weir is doing that for us. Yes, yes. And I think also the other thing we have to do is get kids. Every time you meet a kid that wants, and they're out there, believe me, they're out there. There's a lot of people who want to go to Mars. Tell them, write to your congressman, write to the president, and say, hey, we want space incentives, we want money for space, we want money to go to Mars. Because Congress people respond to letters. They, you know, popularity is not enough. The popularity has to be channeled toward the people that handle the money.
I think that with the exception of Ray Bradbury's Martian stories, any fiction about Mars that has inspired people has had two things in common. And the first is that it's all been imagined afresh. And the second is that it's based on the facts. That was where Ray Bradbury went off the rails there. A while back, I went to the Air and Space Museum here and walked in the door, and there's everything. There's this glory of experience to look at. And when I saw there was a temporary exhibit on the far wall, and I said, wow, what are those paintings? I went right to them like a beeline. From the distance, they were small as postage stamps. They looked great. And when I got up close, they were all Chesley Bonestels. And Chesley was the grand old man of science fiction art. He was the first one, and I believe he's still the artist who has done it best. everybody who does astronomicals after Chesley Bonestell has been influenced by him. But what he did was he had training in art, and then he studied the science, and then he imagined it for himself. And so his will always have a freshness and appeal that that the imitations can't have, because they've just studied him and they're doing an imitation of him. There was one painting there in particular, just a Marsscape seen from the ground. In the distance, there's a little shimmer of green, which might be life, or just might be a little an inversion of the atmosphere. You cannot tell. And I looked at that and I said, someday that painting right there in front of me is going to be hanging in a museum on Mars. And that's the kind of connection that, that sells science.
Yeah, science and science fiction have had a relationship with each other that goes both ways, of course. Science informing science fiction, and then science fiction informing science and space travel for a long time. Werner von Braun actually credited Kurt Lazowitz, a Polish science fiction writer, with his inspiration. He said, wow, he was a contemporary of H.G. Wells, wrote a novel called Auf zwei Planeten, on two planets. And that was what inspired Werner von Braun. Little known fact, von Braun actually wrote his own science fiction novel. He wrote it, in fact, before the Americans had quite gotten around to denazifying the German scientists while he was sort of waiting around without anything to do. So he wrote a science fiction novel. It was terrible. It had a technical appendix, which was as long as the novel. And when he submitted it to a publisher, what they said is, well, this science fiction novel is not very good, but wow, this technical appendix is great. So they published the technical appendix under the title Das Mars Projekt, the Mars Project. And the science fiction novel got put in a drawer, and long after his death, somebody discovered it and said, here's the science fiction novel. So science and science fiction have inspired each other for ages and continues to do so. Of course, a lot of people in the present talk about how they were inspired by Star Trek. You would think, wow, this is out there, it's warp drives, but people say, yes, this is what we want to do. Explore new worlds, find life. Robert Goddard, in fact, said he was inspired by Jules Verne. He looked at the Cannon idea and said, oh, that'll never work. We need something better. I'm going to invent anti-gravity. After a while, he decided anti-gravity didn't work, and he went to rockets. But he started out trying to invent anti-gravity. So science fiction has been the inspiration for science. What we do is the dream, and then the science and the explorers and the technologists turn the dream into reality. And while doing so, give us something new to write about.
In Washington, it is well known that it is not what you know, but who you know. Although the high practitioners of politics know that it's not what you know or who you know, it's what you know about who you know. And so I will parlay what I know about R.W. Bussard. Raised in the 1930s, by the age of 6, he had decided that he wanted to go to Mars, and I kind of grinned when I saw the slides that Jeff had up, because one day I said to Dr. Bussard, Doc, you know, I think you had a thing for Martian princesses. And he got a dreamy look in his eyes, and he says, Tom, you should have seen how they were illustrated. So he was inspired, but nobody really knew how to get to Mars. It's not going to be some cave out in the southwest that you duck into and suddenly find yourself on Mars. So he started looking at rockets. And by the time he was a teenager, he had gone through all of the combinations of solid and liquid rocket fuels, calculated what kind of rockets you could make with them, and concluded that while in fact it was possible to get to Mars, it was just barely possible. And for a kid raised on Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, this was not the kind of performance that he wanted. He was getting a little depressed about it, but this is about the end of the Second World War, and suddenly there's this loud bang heard over Hiroshima. And he realized that he knew about atomic energy, but it was just science fiction then. But suddenly it became real, present technology. And he decided that he wanted to become a nuclear scientist. There were no courses in it, and it was all classified at the time, but he understood that heat exchange was going to be a very important thing, so he became a heat exchanger engineer. Came out of college and proposed to the Air Force Project Rover, and he designed Kiwi-A, the first of the series of reactors. He and another fellow, Delors, literally wrote the book on nuclear rocket propulsion. They actually wrote 2 of them. So he became quite an expert in nuclear rocket propulsion, but it was always aimed at going to Mars. Whatever his sponsors wanted, he wanted to go to Mars. He was still not happy with rover's performance. That was 860 seconds specific impulse, but he still wanted to do better. So in later years, he developed a fusion concept called the Polywell, and that's where I met him, was working on the Polywell. And he never got it working, but his goal for the Polywell was Mars propulsion, and going everywhere else too, but Mars in particular. And he was looking at a fairly short time frame because his goal was to retire to a site he had picked out a little south of Syrtis Major. So that's the kind of fellow we're talking about. And while I'm working for him, he says, Tom, you write science fiction. I want you to write us a science fiction story about using polywells to go to Mars. Now, here are the rules. And this is where it lost all story value, because we all know that you have to have a problem in a story to make the story interesting. And the story is about people overcoming problems. And so when we go to Mars, the rocket breaks, or we get there and there's something in the environment like Barumians or four-armed Martians who come out and slash at you with swords, or there has to be a problem to overcome. And he said, here are the rules, Tom. Since this story is going to be based on what we're doing and my ideas, you can't have anything go wrong on the trip to Mars. Because if you can anticipate the problem, and I haven't anticipated the problem, people will think I'm an idiot. So when we go up there, I'm going to insist that we have multiple ships. This isn't going to be a single lone ship with no possibility of rescue. It's going to be a fleet. We're going to go up there. We're going to have triple redundancy on everything. We're going to have 50 tons of supplies per colonist. And if anything does go wrong, we'll have the ability to fix it, and there's going to be no question that we're going to succeed. And I just kind of slumped down into my seat and said, how am I going to write this?
It's not really realistic either, because one of the definitions, popular definitions of an astronaut is someone who's really good at solving all the problems that come up, all the things that don't work the way you expect it. You have to be able to do that.
Well, the question for me was, how could I make a story? Something had to go wrong.
Yeah.
And at this point, I started talking to my wife. Wife, would you be willing to go to Mars? And like any sensible wife should, she said, hell no. So I started thinking, well, how would I talk her into going to Mars? And this gave me a handle on the story. Now, to tell you what a good handle this was, the story never found a market. But I would like to propose that the basic idea behind this might be something we would want to do in science fiction to show why we should go to Mars. That since I couldn't have anything go wrong on the mission, on Dr. Broussard's side of it, I started pointing out what a dangerous place Earth is. And it started out, we're up at the cabin, and my wife is out by the wood pile getting a little firewood, and something under the wood pile goes, bzzz. She says, Tom, get the snake stick. We've got one under the wood pile. And I come trotting over with a snake stick. You might tell I actually like timber rattlesnakes. Hook him into a trash can and say, you know, there are no rattlesnakes on Mars. He says, yeah, and you'd miss them too, wouldn't you? So we had forest fire tries to come through, and there are earthquakes in California. The big one hits Los Angeles, volcanoes popping off, and of course, terrorists, wars. The Chinese end up with a major revolt because they bred too many men and not enough women, and so they end up with the youth going on a rampage over there. Dr. Broussard actually had a theory that would take about 2,000 nuclear weapons to stop that. So the story ended up that everything that was going wrong was back on Earth, and that we have become so accustomed to the hazards of Earth, we take them as a matter of course, and then we think Mars, which has about 4 salient hazards, it's cold, no air to speak of, meteor strikes, radiation. Mars lacks all the problems people bring. It's pretty much lacks an atmosphere, so it's kind of hard to have forest fires over there. The volcanoes are extinct, and it's geologically pretty quiet, so you're not going to have much in the way of earthquakes. Mars is actually, in a lot of ways, a lot safer than Earth. And it would be interesting to see people play that angle. That really, one of the reasons we want to go to Mars is it's a lifeboat for humanity.
Well, I'd like to follow up on those thoughts with what kind of ideas like these can we use to reach today's youth market? Because they're the ones who will be establishing policy for the next generation. In particular, what's called the YA market is by far the biggest science fiction market right now. I mean, if you look at the most popular movies, Divergent, science fiction, The Hunger Games, science fiction. But they're a different type of science fiction than what you've all been talking about. You know, if it's Mars, they'd probably send zombies or vampires up there. So how do you think we can reach this audience that it's changed? I think the thirst is still there for science fiction. If any of you have some ideas, I'd love to hear them. Michael, why don't we start with you?
I don't see that there's a need to reach them. I think they're a natural audience. If you look at Google Earth, you can see the surface of everywhere on Earth. And when you look at that, you say, with the exception of a couple of places on the poles, somebody has stood there everywhere. 150 years ago, it was possible to go out into Africa or Asia and find some place nobody had ever been. And this is something that pretty much every 17-year-old boy wants to do at some point. I certainly did. The Earth is known. There are no more dragons. You cannot be an explorer in the old sense. I talked to a geologist. They don't do any more exploration in geology because they know where everything is right now. If you were on Mars, you could just put on your suit and you could go walk someplace nobody had ever been before. You could see things that people have never seen before. This is a natural, this is a cry to the heart of every young person in the world.
We do have Google Mars, by the way.
But nobody's been there. Nobody's been anywhere.
But we can use that as a tool to make the point.
Well, the internet, I think, has been a tremendous impetus for kids. How many hits were there when Mir landed? It was like, you know, it went absolutely wild. You know, you say you never walk. We haven't walked on Mars. When Jeff was on Mir, they finally let us, the Mir spouses, get into and look at the same images that were coming down, which was a complete novelty. And there's a stereoscopic image that you can see of just patches of regolith. And it was very strange because you get looking at it and you are walking on Mars. You see, you know, there's a rock. I could almost reach over and pick that rock up. And I think that's what we do. I think the kids are ready. I think there's We just have to have them find us. It's not a matter of us finding them. We have to have them find us. There were some Boy Scouts. Did you notice the Boy Scout troop? It wasn't a whole troop. There were, I think, 4 of them there with their Scoutmaster. And it was cool because I talked to the boys, first of all, and they're amazing young men. These guys are going to be running things in, like, they were 14. There were a pair of twins that were 14 years old. They're going to be running things. They were wearing, they had so many patches that their mother had to have an extra strip to accommodate all those patches. And they were patches in, exciting things and interesting, difficult things, radio communications, things like that. Those people, we have to have them find us, and I think we will, and I think science fiction is the way that's going to happen.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we do need to engage the market for readers that are, not like us, but in the rising generation. Of course, the real people who are excited by it are going to find the science fiction. They don't care that something's labeled as, oh, this is an adult novel for, with all the equations and everything in it. They'll find it. But we want to reach beyond just the science fiction enthusiasts. We would like to break out, to the greater world, like the Hunger Games or Divergence. And I think what we need to do is find writers who just really understand that worldview, that remember that worldview when you're 13. And the lesson of novels like The Hunger Games and Divergence is when you're 13, 14, 15, and you look out into the adult world, what you see is everybody is against you, and they want to stop you from doing what you want to do. And they have a vast authoritative mechanism to stop you from doing what you want to do. So, well, we need some science fiction writers who really can understand that and write to that worldview.
Do you know, I really saw that when I helped coordinate last summer the science fiction and fantasy programming at the Baltimore Book Festival. And our guest of honor was Marissa Meyer, who wrote The Cinder. It's a young adult science fiction trilogy. And her fans, I wish we all had fans like that. There was a young woman who came from New York just to see her and was heartbroken because she missed it. And I'll tell you what made a big difference. Marissa Meyer came back to the festival when she was on the way to the airport just to see this girl, because this girl had missed her. And, and this is an author who, she has the dream. And she told me when she was young, she used to read science fiction, and she goes to conventions. And she is reaching this huge audience. And what I'm particularly inspired to see is that it's both boys and girls. And I see that too in the Chesapeake math program. The girls are excited too. So, maybe we can keep this going, get this ball rolling. And as science fiction authors, connecting with these kids really makes a difference to them. Do any of you have another comment, or shall I go on to the next one?
Well,
all right, well, the next issue that usually comes up when we have these conversations is that people will say, and this follows exactly to what Jeff was talking about, that the people who really have the dream already will find us. There are a lot of people who might be interested if they could be convinced that this is something, that there's actually a reason for it. And I'm sure we've all heard people saying, but why should we go to Mars? Why don't we solve our problems here first?
Yeah.
And I think science fiction, by putting it in a context with characters that people can relate to, do you think that helps answer that question? Why go away from the planet? Why spend resources and time and energy on that?
Well, I've got some
Go ahead.
ideas that may not, this may be sort of unsavory. I figure my Mars colonization fiction deals with some of the things that people might do when they get to Mars, and I think these are probably pretty realistic. Why why did people go to the New World? Well, some of them were sent there because they were bad in terms of the world that they lived in. They had the wrong religion, or possibly they had murdered somebody. Both reasons. Same reason people went to Australia. But why would people go to Mars? First of all, space is a religion. Let's face it. It's no matter what your baseline religion is, whether you're agnostic, whether you're a Christian or whatever, you have a spiritual relationship to the space program, and in the case of the people here, to Mars specifically. So Mars is a religion. There's a religious impulse. We believe spiritually that it is our role to go there. Ray Bradbury says, I'm talking too much, but Ray Bradbury says that God created us as his senses to appreciate the universe that we're in. So why should we not do that? Okay, that's one reason. Another reason is religious freedom. There are people that have religious ideas that don't work on Earth. So, they'll go off, they'll build a ship and go off to Mars so that they can practice bizarre things that we don't appreciate here, or the countries that they're in. Biological research that is too dangerous to conduct on Earth. Genetic research that might get loose and contaminate Earth biological structures. Illegal activities, I've sort of mentioned some of those, but I can imagine the mafia, for example, having a nice little base so that they can conduct things safely on Earth and direct them from there. Keeping things safe, send it up in a spaceship, and it's might be a diamond. Of course, you can't get at it. Your safe deposit box is a long ways away, but nobody's going to steal it up there. And then finally, of course, just glory, because glory is a very attractive thing to most Americans. Anyway, that's my thought.
One of the attractive things to me about the idea of space programs, and particularly who would go to Mars or anywhere else in space, is probably not idiots. If you like being around smart people, it could be a really fun environment. And I think that's an attraction for young people in a way. And another one would be science fiction has a long libertarian streak, particularly when you're talking about space colonization stories. A lot of the old Golden Age guys were really interested in the idea of going someplace to start a different type of government, one that's maybe more democratic and allows more independence. So the more government tends to want to interfere with our life, I think the more a large segment of the population would like the idea of going to places with a little more freedom. When I look back at the colonization of the United States, you have to compare what was going on, say, in England to what was going on here. They were having religious wars in England and people telling you what religion you must have. So you'd have Maryland was colonized by Catholics who were out of power at the time, and Virginia Colony was Church of England, and Plymouth Rock was the Pilgrims, who were some of the Protestants who tried to kick the Catholics out of England. And so there were all this turmoil in England was sending people over here for independence and independent way of thinking. And then they had to all come together and form a government, and it had some very different ideas about individual liberties. The Bill of Rights became maybe our greatest accomplishment when we finally set up our Constitution. That kind of revolutionary thought will probably exist on the colonies, and virtually any story that assumes control of colonies, of space colonies from Earth, is about the revolution. It doesn't last. It never lasts in any of these stories. Earth can't control the colonies.
Well, of course, the Puritans came to America because they hated freedom and wanted to set up a theocratic dictatorship that didn't allow any freedom. The Virginia colonists actually went to Virginia because they literally thought that the soil was filled with gold and that they could get rich by basically shipping the sand back. What they actually discovered was tobacco and potatoes. And tobacco actually was just as valuable as gold, it turned out, after a while. But that was an interesting thing. To some extent, the settlers of the New World came to the New World for completely misguided and silly reasons to us. But one of the things science fiction can do is it can explore these ideas. It can explore the idea, why would people want to go to another planet? And there's many, many, many reasons. And even more exciting, not only can we explore the ideas, but we can make the readers start thinking and asking the question, well, why would I want to go to Mars? What would there be at Mars? Well, this would be cool. I could climb the tallest mountain in the solar system. That would be pretty cool.
Polygamy.
Yeah. Well, okay. Like the
Of course, it might be hard because there
reasons
wouldn't be
that-
enough women, but
the reasons that the Mormons went to Utah. Yeah. Because they were persecuted here or persecuted on the east side of America. But it can allow the readers to start stimulating their own imaginations. So it's not just you're telling them why we should go to Mars, but you're asking them to think, why might we go to Mars? What are the advantages of setting up a new society? Asking the question, what kind of new society might we set up? A feature that isn't perhaps analyzed well enough in science fiction is the economic motivations for going into space.
Yeah.
I think probably all of us believe that there's economic motives for going into space. But when you sort of do the detailed analysis answering the question, well, what is there out in space that will be tremendously valuable, is an interesting question. Of course, perhaps with advances in spaceflight technology, as we get lower cost boosters, as perhaps we start getting nuclear thermal rockets and maybe later even fusion rockets, it will be a little bit less expensive to get out into space, and maybe more things will be cheap enough to bring back to Earth. Robert Heinlein, of course, had his explorers go to the moon and find diamonds on the moon. And in fact, there are diamonds in Heinlein's universe were so plentiful on the moon that they had to have an embargo against bringing diamonds back to Earth, or it would crash the market on Earth. Well, no diamonds on the moon. On the other hand, diamonds are formed by volcanic processes on planets that have carbon. And what do we have on Mars? Giant volcanoes and a carbon dioxide atmosphere. So I'm still hopeful for diamonds on Mars. So there you go.
It's possible there will be an economic reason to go to space soon. I mean, we are running out of a lot of different minerals, some of which our civilization depends on. Strangely enough, there's the possibility of copper going extinct. That's a science fiction idea for you. But I recently, I just came back from China. I spent 3 weeks there. I was meeting with a lot of fans and editors and writers there. And there is an incredible optimism there in China. You go to the second tier and the third tier cities even, they're not building skyscrapers. They are building clusters of skyscrapers, a dozen at a time. The transformation since I was there 8 years ago is astonishing. And this accompanies an overwhelming sense among the young of optimism that the world is opening up for them, that the future has got a place for them, and they can go out and do things and make a difference. And simultaneous with this astonishing burgeoning growths, they legalize science fiction. The argument there, which did have to be made because you do have a totalitarian government, was that their young people are going to need flexible imaginations for dealing with the world they're coming into, especially if they want to start making their mark in design. And they started a space program. It's done pretty well so far. I'm watching with a great deal of interest. Their plans are astonishing. They plan to have to build a colony on the moon. I don't know whether they can do that or not. But essentially, nobody says, why are we doing this? Just they can, so they do. Because a great nation does great things. And everybody knows that going into outer space, colonizing outer space, discovering new worlds, that's part of that's the essence of greatness. I don't think it needs to be explained at all. I think people understand this. I just think the leaders don't.
Do you think that if it became a competition, like if they actually started setting up a colony on the moon, that would inspire our government to?
Oh, that would get us feeling insecure. I was talking to a NASA administrator, and he was talking about the Chinese moon colony, and he said, if it were a race, we couldn't beat them, starting from where both countries are right now. So he says, what we should do is pick something else, like, first man on an asteroid, and say, good luck with your plan, we did it, you'll love it. and just pretend that we're not being competitive.
Well, one time, a few years ago, I was the science guest of honor at a convention called LibertyCon. And one of their other big guests of honor was from NASA. And he was giving a talk about going to Mars, and he asked the audience, how many of you, if you knew, even if you knew it was a one-way trip and you could never come back, but there would be a colony for you to set up, how many of you would go, knowing you could never come home? And 2/3 of the audience raised their hand. Yeah, so, well, first I'll ask them, then I'm going to ask you all. So how many of you would go, even if you knew you couldn't come home?
My first ancestor in Virginia was 1640. He never went back, and he ended up with an awful lot more land than his older brother.
Yeah, good old planet with Mars. Well, see, Jeff and Mary, they're married, by the way.
I looked at him before I
Yeah.
raised my hand, though, you noticed.
I was going to say, if you went,
he'll
you
solve all
would,
the problems when we get there, so it'll be okay.
but you would have each other. I think for me, that was the hardest part. I thought, if I went, I was leaving my husband and my daughter. I couldn't do that. I might have when I was younger, before, those ties were there.
I asked, in the panel yesterday, I asked the panelists whether they would send their children. They were talking specifically about delivery systems, about landing on Mars. And I asked them, and they were it surprised me, because I'd tell my kid to go if he wanted to, in a heartbeat. I've got 2 little grandnephews that are quite bright, and I just figure, if they want to go to Mars, heck, I'd say yes, I'll help fund the journey.
It will make a hell of a holiday to visit the kids.
That's true. Well, how many people here would, even if you knew you couldn't come home? Wow, quite a few. Well, that's encouraging. Well, it's a self-selected audience, but still, if there's that much interest, I believe we're going to get there. How are we doing on time?
You have about 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, I would like to take those 2 minutes to thank the panelists for coming, and to thank our wonderful hosts for being so gracious to us, especially about us changing the structure of the panel at the last minute. And thank you all for coming. It's been wonderful.